Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're going to dive back into some Philomena Cunk today. This will be our third time taking a look at clips from her. If you're not familiar with her, she is actually an actress named Diane Morgan who is playing a part of someone who seems to be making serious documentaries about various historic subjects, but she really just comes across as knowing no idea what she's talking about. And I'm told they instruct the historians that she interviews to basically treat her like a child. And the result is pretty funny. So what we're going to do is today we're going to be taking a look at some clips of her talking about American history. And as always, we'll laugh, we'll be entertained, but I'll also try to actually interject with some real history and maybe expound on some of the subjects that she's butchering in the process. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Ask a medieval peasant where America was and you'd get a blank look. Or worse still, the plague. Columbo
What? Or worse still, the plague. So, yeah, the plague is obviously a thing that hits at various times. Some of the worst plague happens, though, in like the 1300s. You have like maybe a third to one half of the European population being wiped out. So by the time America is on the scene in the 1500s, plague is not nearly as big a thing as it was previously, but it's still a killer.
Thought that if he sailed off the edge of the map, he'd reappear on the other side like Pac-Man. At first, the European colonists found life in the New World hard. Luckily, some Native Americans taught them how to grow corn and where to fish. In exchange, the colonists introduced the Native Americans to smallpox. After arriving...
All true. The Native Americans did, well, I should say that in some cases they helped. In other times, the colonists helped themselves. So, for example, when they landed in what is now Massachusetts and founded the Plymouth colony, they found some of the corn that the natives had hid and buried, and they just helped themselves to it. But yeah, the Native Americans did help them initially, and there were diseases on both sides that got introduced, right? Because a community builds up a tolerance to certain things, and when they've never been exposed to a disease, it's going to ravage them. So smallpox not really being a thing in North America, there's no tolerance built up. So even though it would kill a lot of Europeans, it was worse for the natives. And I believe that syphilis was introduced to Europeans from the native population.
in America to forge a life of honest hard work and toil, many of these colonists quickly discovered they couldn't be arsed. So they stole people from Africa and made them do it instead. What started the tension between the British and the Americans? Was it because you say cookies and we say biscuits, and you say sidewalk and we say pavement? Because I find in a relationship it's those little things that start to grate after a while.
That's true. If you think about it in relationships, there are certain things that you find really cute and really endearing at first, but then eventually they can become really annoying over time. I love some of the differences that we have, and even little things like we're listening to Ed Sheeran's new CD in the car, and he's got a song called Colorblind, which is a fantastic song, but it's got that U in it, the way that the British people spell color, whereas we don't. And some of those things are interesting. Some of them can be really confusing, like soccer, what we call cleats in America, are boots over there, and what we call out of bounds, the Brits call into touch, things like that when it comes to soccer. Just little things like that it takes some time to get used to.
So when the people in Boston got angry with the British, why did they just hold a prissy tea party instead of having a proper fight like British men would?
Would you voluntarily, when you didn't have to, go to jail?
It depends what facilities they had, I think.
76, the leader...
So the Boston Tea Party, as she's talking about there, obviously is a protest by Americans, the Sons of Liberty, which is kind of this organization that is formed in the Boston area. They're basically protesting what they see as taxation without representation being imposed on the colonies. And Boston is the hotbed where all of this goes down, and this is where the tension gets escalated, and this is where the British crack down the most, and eventually it spreads. But the Boston Tea Party is because the British basically instructed that tea has to be purchased through British companies. They can't import it from somewhere else. And so they dress up as Native Americans, and they go and they basically dump what amounts to $1 million worth of tea into the water.
Of the 13 colonies decided that they didn't want to be called British anymore, but Americans.
This straight white supergroup known as the Founding Fathers drafted the most famous breakup text in history, the Declaration of Independence.
And invented camouflage.
And it's cool that they do that, because if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, King George's response to what is known as the Olive Branch Petition, which was this last-ditch attempt by the colonies to stave off independence and try to reconcile with the British Crown, he responds to that in a song called You'll Be Back, which is basically his breakup song to America. So it's interesting to hear her describe it that way.
The British troops of the time wore bright red coats and were consequently shot in their thousands while looking amazing. George Washington crossing the Delaware River.
As you can see, he had to stand up for the whole journey because he hadn't reserved a seat. He didn't fall in, but he also didn't help with the rowing.
So this particular painting actually also shows James Monroe, the future president, who we have no evidence if he was on the same boat as Washington, but he was a part of the attack on Trenton.
Washington won, becoming America's first president, the single most revered role in the world until 2016.
Meaning when Donald Trump was elected. I think we've had others as well that maybe people didn't look so highly at.
I read somewhere that America isn't just a country, but an idea. But it is just a country, isn't it? Having a sandwich, that's an idea. Painting your bicycle blue, that's an idea. Going, that's an idea. America is just a place.
She's taking it up a notch on this one. Just I just try to put myself in the shoes of these historians that she's interviewing. These are like serious academic people. These are people who are all about teaching history, and having this woman come along, it would be fun. I think it would actually be a lot of fun to try and kind of keep up with her, and I'm sure these people have to know what they're getting into.
They believed in something called manifest destiny, the belief that all the land belonged to them, and that God wanted them to go west and claim it back from the Native Americans he put there first by mistake.
He'd put there first by mistake. 100% true. Manifest destiny is this idea that honestly, even though it maybe wasn't described that way at the time, is one of the unspoken motivations behind the American Revolution. And I've talked about this before, but you've got the Appalachian Mountains, which run basically the whole length of the eastern coast. And they were kind of the western boundary of the colonies at the time. Well, there's a lot of land on the other side of those mountains, but the British government had agreements in place with the Native American tribes that they weren't going to settle in that area. They would send trappers and traders and things like that. But the American colonists saw all that land. And you see that in the aftermath of the Revolution, that there's this massive expansion all the way to the Mississippi River, because a lot of this land was given as land grants to soldiers for their service in the Revolution. So places like Kentucky and Ohio and Tennessee get massively settled, and this is the beginning stages of manifest destiny, the idea that America is destined, and some people said, yeah, by God, to own everything all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Testing your destiny was dangerous. You had to trundle across a perilous landscape in a rickety wagon on the brink of starvation or shitting yourself to death with dysentery, getting bitten by snakes or butchered by Apaches, almost as if God didn't want them to do this after all.
That's actually a really solid point to make, right? If you believe it's your destiny that God ordained for you to do this, but you're constantly running into death and destruction and starvation and illness and all these things, it might cause you to second guess whether it was the right idea. I think the number is something like 10% of people who set out on the journey on like the Oregon Trail died before they made it. So the vast majority of people did make it.
But Americans back then weren't the humble, unassuming people they still aren't today. It's hard to imagine a world where Edison didn't invent the light bulb. And even if you did imagine it, it would be too dark to see what was in it. So we had daylight during the day and we had candles at night.
Yes.
So we didn't need light bulbs. His life's work was meaningless. That must have been a real moment the first time someone realised a plane needed a toilet. That's more impressive than the Wright brothers.
Use of firearms is an integral
Just random clips that we're seeing here, but interesting stuff. Now we're going to talk about guns.
part of their national identity.
How come Americans have the right to kill anyone they want with a gun?
Well, they don't. Murder is illegal in the United States, but they do have the right to own weapons.
They have the right to bear arms.
Correct.
But bears don't have arms.
They do, actually.
Oh, do they? I
Yes.
thought they were legs.
Well, I'm not a biologist, but I suppose that when they stand up, they're probably arms.
With its cowboys and guns and steam train rides, America became known as the land of the free, which must have come as a surprise to all the slaves.
Wow. That was dark, and it is so true. I mean, the hypocrisy of Americans in the 1770s fighting for their freedom while a third of the country is systematically denying freedom to an entire group of people is impossible to overlook.
But by finally thinking hard about the subject, the people of the northern states made a horrifying discovery: that inside each slave was an actual human person. Abraham Lincoln was shot in the theatre box, wasn't he? Where is that on the body?
Oh, I think...
And why was he shot? Was it because he wouldn't take his hat off? Because that's quite annoying in the theatre, isn't it, when someone's in front of you with a hat on?
Well, he was in the...
How did being shot in the head affect Lincoln's ability to lead?
Well, it ended it because he died about 12 hours after he was shot.
So he couldn't carry on?
He couldn't. No, not as a corpse, unfortunately.
Not as a corpse. He's just going right along with this like it's nothing at all. It's fantastic. And there was nobody sitting behind Lincoln. Lincoln and his wife were in a box with Major Henry Rathbone and his, I don't know if she was girlfriend or fiance by this point. He eventually married her. Her name was Clara Harris. And he actually ended up murdering her years later. But originally it was supposed to be Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. But a couple of things. Grant wanted to go home and see his kids. They lived in New Jersey, real close to Philadelphia, and at the time. And also his wife didn't particularly care for Mrs. Lincoln because, like a lot of other military wives, she had had encounters with Mrs. Lincoln that left her with a less than favorable impression. Mrs. Lincoln was already dealing with mental illness that would only get worse after her husband was killed, and then she lost a third son when her son Tad died.
Why don't bicycles have toilets? You know, it would save you having to get off. I might write that down and copyright it.
Even without a toilet, the Wright brothers' historic flight changed transportation forever in ways that still aren't fully understood.
The Wright brothers did the first proper flight over 100 years ago. How come we're still not any closer to working out how aeroplanes actually work? That's your theory. Do you want to hear my theory?
Okay.
I think they run on belief. It's just because we believe planes can fly that they do. So the media has to keep up the pretense, or they're just going to start dropping out of the sky.
They run on belief. As an Ohioan, I always have to point out that the Wright brothers were from Ohio. They're from Dayton. They weren't from North Carolina. A lot of people seem to think they're from North Carolina because that's where they did their flight.
But Abraham Lincoln's story didn't have a happy ending. 5 days after the North won, a terrible fate befell him. He was forced to go to the theatre to watch a play.
He was put out of his misery by a kindly gunman, but cruelly, not until the third act.
Not until the third act. So the play's called Our American Cousin. And specifically, because here's the thing about this is, you know, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He's not as big an actor as his brother Edwin Booth, who might be one of the most popular actors in America. But Booth's very well known. He's well recognized, and he actually would receive his mail at Ford's Theater when he was in town. And so it wasn't a really huge deal for people to see John Wilkes Booth walking around the theater. That's why he could get away with this, and he could get away with sneaking up toward where the president's box was. And he goes up there, and he knows the play. So he's actually waiting for this one particular laugh line. So it'll kind of muffle the sounds of him firing. The line specifically is this guy says something like, "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap." And everybody laughs, and that's when Booth fires. And then, of course, he famously jumps, and they say that the spurs that are on his boots from riding the horse catch on a flag on his way down, and he breaks his leg. And he ends up having to get that leg set by this Dr. Samuel Mudd, who actually gets sentenced to life in prison for helping Booth, and that was later commuted. But interesting story. The whole thing's very fascinating. All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there with those clips on Cunk talking about American history. Big thank you to all of our patrons for your continued support. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.